You must be joking, old man. The voice was sharp, cutting through the oppressive heat of the engine room like a blade. Lieutenant Commander Derek Stone stood with his arms crossed, his pristine Navy working uniform still bearing the sharp creases from the laundry, sweat already beginning to darken the fabric at his collar. He was 31 years old, a graduate of Annapolis with honors, and the youngest chief engineer ever assigned to the USS Resolute, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser. His face was twisted in a mixture of frustration and barely concealed contempt as he stared at the figure standing quietly near the massive turbine housing. The old man wore faded orange coveralls that had seen better decades, the fabric worn thin at the knees and elbows. A dark blue baseball cap with a tarnished anchor insignia sat on his white-haired head. His face was deeply lined, weathered by what looked like 1,000 storms at sea. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, hung calmly at his sides. He didn't look at the lieutenant commander. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the silent machinery before them, studying it with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient. Behind Stone stood a dozen young naval engineers, their faces masks of exhaustion and frustration. They had been working for 72 hours straight, trying to restart the ship's main propulsion system. Every diagnostic had been run. Every procedure in the manual had been followed to the letter. The ship's computer systems showed green across the board. Everything should have been working. But the Resolute sat dead in the water, drifting in the middle of the Pacific, a $3 billion piece of military hardware rendered as useless as a rowboat without oars. Stone gestured dismissively toward the old man. Captain Reeves sent you down here? What are you supposed to be, some kind of good luck charm? A mascot? The old man's name was Thomas Mackenzie. He was 76 years old and had been quietly living in a small coastal town in Maine for the past 20 years. He'd received the call 3 days ago, a request from an old friend who now wore 4 stars on his collar. The message had been simple: "We need you, Tom, one last time." Stone took a step closer, his voice rising with each word. "I have 3 advanced degrees in mechanical engineering. My team has certifications in every system on this vessel. We have diagnostic equipment that can detect a fault down to the molecular level, and they send me a retiree in coveralls and a fishing hat." One of the younger engineers, a petty officer named Chen, shifted uncomfortably. She'd been watching the old man since he'd entered the engine room. There was something in the way he stood, in the absolute stillness of his posture, that reminded her of her grandfather, who had served on destroyers in Vietnam. She'd seen that same quiet patience, that same unshakable calm in the face of chaos. "Sir," she ventured carefully, "maybe we should just let him take a look. What harm could it do?" Stone whirled on her, his frustration finally boiling over. "The harm is that we are wasting time. Every hour this ship is offline is a national security risk. We are supposed to be part of a carrier strike group heading to the South China Sea. Instead, we're floating like a bathtub toy because I'm being told to step aside for someone's retired uncle who probably hasn't touched a wrench since the Cold War ended." He turned back to Thomas. "No offense, old-timer, but this isn't your father's Navy anymore. These engines are controlled by integrated computer systems. They're monitored by artificial intelligence. They self-diagnose and self-correct. You can't just tap something with a hammer and expect it to work." Thomas finally moved. He reached into the deep pocket of his coveralls and pulled out a worn leather tool roll. It was ancient, the leather cracked and darkened, with decades of oil and use. He unrolled it slowly, revealing a collection of tools that looked like they belonged in a maritime museum. Stone let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You cannot be serious. What are those, antiques? Are you going to fix a 21st century warship with tools from World War II? Thomas didn't answer. He selected a single tool from the roll, a peculiar-looking wrench, with a custom bent handle, and a head that had clearly been hand-modified. He walked slowly toward the main turbine assembly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As he approached the massive piece of machinery, the world around him seemed to shift and blur. The harsh fluorescent lights of the modern engine room faded, replaced by the dim red glow of battle stations lighting. The smell of fresh paint and cleaning chemicals was overwhelmed by the thick scent of oil, sweat, and fear. He wasn't 76 anymore. He was 23, a young machinist's mate aboard the USS Lawrence during the evacuation of Saigon. The engine room was shaking with the impact of small arms fire against the hull. The chief engineer was screaming into the intercom that they needed full power now, that there were helicopters inbound with refugees and hostile forces closing in. The main turbine had developed a harmonic vibration that the computer systems couldn't identify. Thomas had closed his eyes then, just as he did now, and listened. Not with his ears, but with his entire body, feeling the rhythm of the machine through the deck plates under his feet. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had come. Thomas was back in the present, standing before the silent turbine. He placed his weathered hand on the housing, his palm flat against the cool metal. Stone watched this display with growing irritation. What is he doing? Is he praying to it? This is insane. Chen, however, had pulled out her phone, not to record the scene, but to send a message. She had a cousin who worked in the office of the Chief of Naval Operations. It was a massive breach of protocol, but her instincts were screaming at her that something important was happening, something her lieutenant commander was too arrogant to see. Her fingers flew across the screen. Need urgent verification. Old sailor named Thomas Mackenzie just brought aboard the Resolute. Lieutenant Commander Stone is about to throw him off the ship. Request immediate background check and command guidance. She hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her heart pounding. If she was wrong, her career was over. If she was right, she might be saving it. In the air-conditioned office of Admiral James Porter, Chief of Naval Operations, a young ensign was monitoring the secure message traffic when Chen's text came through on a priority channel. He read it once, then read it again, his eyes widening. He stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward and crashed into the wall. "Admiral," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, you need to see this immediately." Admiral Porter looked up from the classified briefing he was reviewing, his expression one of controlled annoyance. "This had better be worth the interruption, ensign." The young officer handed him a tablet with Chen's message displayed. Porter read the name Thomas Mackenzie, and his face went completely white. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Get me a secure line to the Resolute. Now, get me the captain of that ship on the phone immediately, and find out who the hell authorized Thomas Mackenzie to be treated as anything less than a 5-star admiral." The ensign stammered. "Sir, I don't have any files on a Thomas Mackenzie. He's not in the active duty database, because he's in the legacy vault, you fool." Admiral Porter's voice was tight, with barely controlled urgency. "Thomas Mackenzie is a name that doesn't appear in public records. He's one of the original plank owners of what became modern naval engineering. During the evacuation of Saigon, he kept 6 ships running under fire that every manual said should have been scuttled. He personally trained 3 generations of master chiefs. He wrote half the unofficial procedures that actually keep our fleet moving. He is a living legend, and he's apparently being disrespected on one of my ships. Get me that connection now." Back in the engine room, Stone had reached his limit. He strode forward and grabbed Thomas's shoulder, physically pulling the old man away from the turbine. "That's enough. I've indulged this circus long enough. Security is going to escort you off this vessel, and I'm going to have a very pointed conversation with whoever thought this was a good idea." Thomas turned slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting Stone's furious gaze. For the first time since entering the engine room, he spoke. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made several of the younger engineers unconsciously straighten their postures. "Son," he said calmly, "you're looking at the wrong system. Your diagnostics are fine, your procedures are correct, but you're listening to the computers instead of listening to the ship." Stone's face reddened. "I don't have time for mystical nonsense, old man. Ships don't talk. They're machines. They operate on physics and engineering principles, not feelings. You need to leave now, before I have you removed." The tension in the room had reached a breaking point when the sound of running footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. The hatch burst open, and the ship's captain, Commander Sarah Reeves, rushed in, followed by her executive officer. Her face was flushed, her normally composed expression replaced by one of barely controlled urgency. "Lieutenant Commander Stone," she barked, "step away from that man immediately. That is a direct order." Stone turned, confused and angry. "Captain, this civilian has been interfering with my repair operations. I was just about to have him escorted off the ship." Commander Reeves walked directly up to Stone, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You have no idea what you've just done. That civilian is Thomas Mackenzie." Stone blinked, the name meaning nothing to him. The captain's executive officer, an older commander named Harris who had been in the Navy for 25 years, had gone pale. He knew the name. Every senior chief in the fleet knew the name, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. Captain Reeves turned to Thomas, and in a gesture that shocked everyone in the room, she came to attention and saluted. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said formally, "I apologize for the reception you've received. Admiral Porter is on a secure line and has ordered me to give you complete access to any system you require." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Stone stood frozen, his mind trying to process what was happening. Chen quietly stepped forward, her phone showing the reply she'd received from her cousin. "Message received." Admiral Porter himself responding. "Mackenzie is Code Omega Legacy status. Do not interfere. Command inbound." Thomas simply nodded to the captain, then turned back to the turbine. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and placed his modified wrench on a specific bolt located deep within the housing. A bolt that wasn't even marked on the digital schematics the engineers had been using. "It's the harmonic dampener bypass valve," he said quietly. "It's a modification we made to the original design back in 1987. It's not in your computer records because it was a field modification that worked so well it became standard. But the documentation was never updated in the digital transition. When the system goes through a cold restart, this valve can stick in a closed position. The computer doesn't see it as a fault because as far as the computer knows, that valve doesn't exist." He gave the wrench a single precise quarter turn. There was a soft click, barely audible over the ambient noise of the engine room. Then a low hum began to build. The deck plates started to vibrate with the familiar rhythm of a ship coming back to life. On the main control panel, lights that had been stubbornly red for 3 days suddenly flickered amber, then blazed green. The turbine housing began to emit its characteristic whine as it spun up to operational speed. The entire engine room seemed to exhale, the tension releasing as the ship's heart began to beat once more. The young engineers stared in stunned silence. Stone's face had gone from red to ashen white. He looked from the now functioning turbine to the old man in coveralls, his entire understanding of his own expertise crumbling around him. Commander Reeves's radio crackled to life. "Bridge reports full power restored to all systems," the voice reported. "We have propulsion. We have steering. All boards are green." The captain looked at Thomas with an expression of profound respect. "Mr. Mackenzie, the fleet owes you a debt. Again." Thomas stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his pocket. He looked directly at Lieutenant Commander Stone. The young officer seemed to shrink under that calm, steady gaze. "Technology is a tool, son," Thomas said gently. "But the sea doesn't care about your degrees. The ships don't care about your certifications. They need people who understand that machines have rhythms, that metal has memory, and that sometimes the most important knowledge isn't written down anywhere. It's carried in the hands and hearts of the people who've spent their lives listening." Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing, so this channel can reach more people like you. Now back to the story. The consequences were swift but measured. Lieutenant Commander Stone was not relieved of his position. Thomas had specifically requested that he remain, stating that the young officer had potential if he could learn humility. Instead, Stone was assigned as Thomas's direct assistant for the next month, tasked with documenting every piece of unofficial knowledge, every field modification, every trick and technique that existed in the memory of the old sailors, but nowhere in the official manuals. A new program was created across the entire naval engineering community. It was called the Mackenzie Initiative, and it paired young engineers with retired master chiefs and senior enlisted personnel to preserve the institutional knowledge that was being lost in the transition from analog to digital, from apprenticeship to academia. The initiative became a model for all branches of the military, a recognition that progress and tradition were not enemies, but partners. 2 months later, in a small diner in a coastal town in Maine, a young man in civilian clothes sat nervously at a corner booth. He'd driven 6 hours to get there, rehearsing what he would say the entire way. Thomas Mackenzie entered the diner, ordered his usual coffee, and spotted the young man immediately. He walked over and slid into the seat across from him without being invited. Derek Stone looked up, his face showing the marks of genuine humility that only comes from being thoroughly humbled. "Mr. Mackenzie," he began. Thomas held up a hand. "Tom is fine, son. We're not on a ship." Stone nodded, his throat tight. "I wanted to thank you for not ending my career, for teaching me instead of just proving me wrong." Thomas took a sip of his coffee, his pale blue eyes studying the young man across from him. "You had the knowledge, Derek. You just didn't have the wisdom yet. There's a difference. Knowledge is knowing how something works. Wisdom is understanding why it sometimes doesn't work the way it should." Stone reached into his bag and pulled out a thick binder. "I've been compiling everything you taught me. All the field modifications, the undocumented procedures, the techniques that aren't in any manual. I've submitted it to the Naval Engineering Command. They're going to make it part of the official training curriculum." Thomas smiled, a genuine expression of pride. "That's good work. That's important work. You're building a bridge between what we knew and what you're learning. That's how we keep the fleet strong." Stone hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on him since that day in the engine room. "How did you know? How did you know exactly where to look, exactly what was wrong, when our computers couldn't find it?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the gray Atlantic waters visible in the distance. When you spend enough time with the ships, when you really listen to them, you start to understand their language. It's not magic. It's not mystical. It's just attention. It's caring enough to notice the small things, the things that don't show up on screens. He turned back to Stone. "You're going to be a fine engineer, Derek. You have the education and the intelligence. Now you're learning the patience and the humility. Those are the things that will make you great." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, a teacher and a student, separated by decades but united by their love of the ships and the sea that had shaped them both.